The first invoice arrived before sunrise, not from an internationally recognized maritime authority, not from an organization empowered by global shipping law. Instead, it came from a newly announced institution claiming authority over one of the world's most important waterways. Whether such claims could ever gain international acceptance was almost beside the point. The objective was never simply to collect money. It was to reshape the conversation around who controlled access to the Strait of Hormuz. That distinction matters, because throughout modern history, strategic waterways have rarely been governed by military strength alone. They are shaped by legal arguments, diplomatic recognition, commercial confidence, and the willingness of shipping companies to accept or reject the rules placed before them. In this case, analysts argued that Tehran was attempting to create something far more ambitious than another political statement. It was testing whether administrative control could become another instrument of strategic leverage. The proposal described several categories of transit-related charges, presented in technical language that resembled the format used by legitimate maritime regulators: environmental oversight, navigation coordination, security administration, transit certification. Individually, none of these concepts sounded extraordinary. Together, they created the appearance of an institutional framework rather than a simple demand for payment. That appearance was important, because international commerce depends heavily on predictability. If enough shipping companies begin treating a new authority as operationally relevant even without formal recognition, that authority can slowly influence commercial behavior. For Tehran, the experiment may have been less about immediate revenue than about testing whether commercial uncertainty itself could become leverage. But the response came almost immediately. American officials publicly rejected any suggestion that the newly announced organization possessed legitimate authority over international navigation. Commercial operators were advised that internationally recognized maritime rules remained unchanged and that freedom of navigation through the strait would continue to be supported. The message was remarkably concise. Rather than entering a prolonged legal debate, Washington focused on operational certainty. The objective was simple: reduce uncertainty before uncertainty could influence commercial decisions. From a strategic perspective, speed mattered more than volume. Shipping companies rarely have the luxury of waiting weeks for diplomatic clarification. Insurance providers, charter operators, cargo owners, port authorities, all of them calculate risk in real time. If governments hesitate, markets begin making their own assumptions. That is exactly what policymakers try to prevent. For decades, the Strait of Hormuz has represented far more than a narrow stretch of water. It functions as one of the world's most important energy corridors. Every disruption, whether military, political, or even rhetorical, immediately attracts global attention because energy markets respond long before physical shortages appear. Sometimes prices move simply because traders believe future disruptions might occur. In other words, perception itself becomes part of the battlefield. That is why both sides increasingly appear to compete not only through military deployments but through narratives. One side attempts to demonstrate administrative influence. The other attempts to reinforce confidence that international shipping remains protected. Neither objective necessarily requires direct confrontation. Instead, they compete for something less visible but equally valuable: credibility. This reflects a broader pattern that has emerged throughout recent years. Modern strategic competition increasingly combines military capability with legal interpretation, diplomatic messaging, financial pressure, technological surveillance, and commercial psychology. Success is measured not only by what happens at sea, but by how insurance markets react, by whether shipping companies alter routes, by whether energy traders adjust prices, and by whether allies continue believing established security guarantees remain credible. From this perspective, every announcement carries consequences beyond its immediate wording. A press release becomes part of deterrence. A navigation advisory becomes part of strategic communication. Even silence can influence expectations. Analysts often describe this as competition over the information environment. Each side seeks to shape how governments, businesses, investors, and ordinary observers interpret unfolding events. Because once perceptions begin shifting, strategic realities frequently follow. That helps explain why reactions came so quickly. Allowing uncertainty to spread would have created its own costs. Removing uncertainty became almost as important as responding to the proposal itself. Meanwhile, commercial operators faced a practical calculation. Shipping companies generally prioritize stability over politics. Their business depends on predictable schedules, reliable insurance coverage, and uninterrupted trade. Whenever competing authorities issue conflicting guidance, uncertainty itself becomes expensive. Every additional question increases financial risk. Every ambiguous regulation complicates logistics. For that reason, international maritime commerce usually follows whichever framework appears most widely recognized and operationally enforceable. History repeatedly demonstrates this principle. Control over global trade routes depends not only on geography. It depends on confidence. Confidence that vessels can sail safely. Confidence that rules will remain consistent. Confidence that commercial decisions made today will still make sense tomorrow. Without that confidence, shipping slows, insurance costs rise, and global supply chains begin absorbing additional friction. That is precisely why strategic waterways occupy such a unique position in international affairs. They are simultaneously military spaces, commercial corridors, diplomatic pressure points, and economic lifelines. Every action taken there resonates far beyond the surrounding coastline. As events continued unfolding, one reality became increasingly clear. The debate was no longer centered on a single invoice or a newly announced administrative body. It had evolved into a much larger contest over influence. Who defines the rules? Who guarantees navigation? Who possesses the credibility necessary for international commerce to continue operating normally? Those questions remain far more significant than any individual announcement. Because in the modern world, strategic competition is rarely decided by a single dramatic confrontation. More often, it develops through countless smaller decisions made by governments, shipping companies, insurers, financial markets, and international institutions. Each decision reinforces one version of stability over another. And together, those choices gradually determine who truly shapes one of the world's most important waterways. Yet the most revealing part of this episode may not have been the legal arguments or the diplomatic statements. It was what the entire sequence suggested about the broader strategic balance. For years, pressure surrounding the Strait of Hormuz has followed a familiar pattern. One side introduces a new mechanism designed to increase political or economic leverage. The other side moves quickly to reassure commercial markets that existing navigation rules remain intact. Each cycle becomes a test not simply of military capability but of institutional credibility. Military analysts often note that this is how prolonged strategic competition evolves. The earliest moves tend to rely on complex diplomatic initiatives, carefully crafted legal arguments, and multilateral negotiations. As those options become less effective, governments sometimes shift toward increasingly visible demonstrations of authority. Administrative announcements, expanded regulatory claims, new enforcement proposals, public declarations intended as much for international audiences as for domestic ones. Whether these initiatives ultimately succeed depends less on the announcement itself than on how the international system responds. If shipping companies continue operating under existing frameworks, the practical impact remains limited. If insurance providers refuse to recognize the new authority, commercial incentives remain unchanged. If major maritime powers continue guaranteeing freedom of navigation, confidence within global markets often stabilizes quickly. That interaction between commercial confidence and military deterrence has become one of the defining characteristics of 21st century maritime competition. Unlike traditional naval conflicts, the objective is not always to stop ships physically. Sometimes it is enough to influence the calculations of those deciding whether ships should sail at all. Markets become participants. Insurance firms become strategic actors. Legal advisors become almost as important as naval commanders, because every decision ultimately affects whether global trade continues moving efficiently. This explains why governments devote enormous attention to communication during periods of maritime tension. Statements are issued rapidly. Navigation advisories are updated. Diplomatic channels remain active. Not because words replace military power, but because words can prevent uncertainty from spreading faster than facts. Strategists frequently emphasize that uncertainty carries its own economic cost. A shipping company uncertain about future regulations may delay departures. Energy traders uncertain about future supply routes may adjust prices immediately. Financial markets often react long before physical disruptions actually occur. Managing expectations, therefore, becomes part of national strategy. In many respects, modern maritime security is built upon maintaining confidence rather than demonstrating force alone. The ships moving through Hormuz represent far more than commercial cargo. They symbolize the stability of an international trading system upon which dozens of economies depend. Any perception that those rules are changing even temporarily immediately attracts worldwide attention. That is why every announcement involving the strait receives scrutiny far beyond the Middle East. Asian manufacturing depends on uninterrupted energy supplies. European markets monitor transportation costs. Global insurers reassess exposure. Energy-minus importing countries evaluate contingency plans. What appears to be a regional dispute rapidly becomes an international economic question. This broader perspective also helps explain why multiple regional governments continue encouraging dialogue even during periods of heightened tension. Every escalation increases uncertainty. Every successful diplomatic engagement reduces it. For neighboring states whose economies rely heavily on regional stability, preserving open sea lanes remains a strategic necessity regardless of broader political disagreements. At the same time, the military dimension never disappears. Naval deployments continue. Air surveillance remains active. Intelligence collection expands. Exercises become more frequent. Each side seeks to demonstrate readiness without necessarily crossing the threshold into direct confrontation. That balance is extraordinarily difficult to maintain. Too little deterrence risks encouraging further pressure. Too much pressure risks unintended escalation. Managing that equilibrium has become one of the central strategic challenges in the Gulf. Analysts often describe Hormuz as a place where economics, diplomacy, law, and military planning intersect more directly than almost anywhere else in the world. Every decision influences several domains simultaneously. A legal announcement affects insurance. An insurance decision affects shipping. Shipping affects energy markets. Energy markets influence global inflation. A regional development quickly becomes an international one. Perhaps that is the most important lesson. The competition surrounding the Strait of Hormuz is no longer simply about geography. It is about who can maintain confidence in the international system, who can persuade commercial operators that existing rules remain reliable, who can convince partners that stability is still achievable, and who can shape expectations before markets make those decisions on their own. The headlines may focus on official statements, diplomatic meetings, or military deployments, but beneath those headlines lies a quieter contest. A contest over credibility, over confidence, and over which vision of regional order the international shipping industry ultimately chooses to trust. Because in modern strategic competition, influence is rarely measured only by territory controlled or forces deployed. Increasingly, it is measured by something far less visible. Which side succeeds in convincing the rest of the world that global commerce can continue moving without interruption? And in a waterway as strategically significant as the Strait of Hormuz, that confidence may prove to be the most valuable asset of all.